In the interview that's going to make up the meat of this episode, you're going to hear some slightly, I don't know if disturbing is the right word, but sad or nasty stories that I'll recount from my childhood years. Basically, there's a couple of teachers who were at the high school I attended, one of whom was officially done in court for like paedophilia, basically grooming and molesting, taking advantage of female students in this high school, and another teacher where I'm really just, I can only allege stuff, but basically I know that he was very much the same, if not similar. The reason these stories come up is because this is basically what this book in this episode is about. The book is Fang First Love Paradise, and it's about, well, it's a story of a girl who's basically sexually assaulted, then sort of groomed or manipulated into a relationship with a man who's middle-aged, and she's growing up through her teens while this is happening. That's the core of the book, really. Pretty rough. So if you don't want to hear this stuff, I guess just skip the episode, but I would recommend you do listen, and I would even recommend you read the book, because not only is it an important story, I do actually think it's a very strong piece of literature. I believe at the time of recording, this one's not actually published in English yet, so this will be one to look out for if you would need to read it in English translation. It is available in the original language, Chinese. It's a Taiwanese book, and its translator is the guest for the episode. It's a returning guest, Jenna Tang. Really fantastic to have her back, and I'm happy that she was ready and keen to discuss this book that she translated, even though it's pretty difficult or uncomfortable conversation in some ways. But it's the sort of book that I guess is intended, one would assume or one would hope or whatever, to start these difficult conversations, and even if it's whether it's to make the future a nicer place to live in for everyone, but especially for girls and young women, or whether it's to reflect a bit on the past and things we experienced or were near to growing up. So before that, pretty heavy but hopefully entertaining interview begins, we're going to go, as we always do, to the news segment, the translated Chinese fiction news, the TrChFic news. I got 4 items, all pretty meaty ones, I'm happy to say. So the first one, it's a damn rival. Just as my podcast is winding down, a new website is launched. They're called the China Books Review. I think they're American based, and they're covering, I guess, all things Chinese books. The editor is Alec Ash, the sort of guy who you thought might have been a guest on the pod, but never quite was. Yeah, he's the big editor, and they're doing blogs, they're doing news, and they're going to be doing a podcast as well. So, this would have been, perhaps there will be some overlap. I'm clicking on their podcast page now. There you go. They already have 1 episode. So this one is running the same time as me. So it is another rival. It looks like they're hosting their show on Buzzsprout. So there you go. Check it out. Okay, the next news item. It's a new book from Cambria Press. So they're an academic press, and one of their, the speciality of theirs that I know about is translated Chinese stuff. Although they're an academic press, they do translated Chinese fiction. I'm just looking at the cover of this book. It's really great, actually. I guess they've used some kind of a modernist painting either from or of the sort of swinging 20s, sort of like modern Mingguo, yeah, like decadent posh Mingguo, Republic of China people. And the book is Urban Scenes by lèyuán, and it's, I'll just read the blurb. Here we go. Or this is a quote from Kirk A. Denton, an academic, and he says this of this book. In this fascinating collection of short fiction, lèyuán experiments with language and narrative to explore new modes of expression to capture China's dizzying shift from tradition to modernity in the 1920s. Although mostly narrated from a male perspective, the many strong female characters who boldly assert their independence and sexuality reflect the changing conceptions of womanhood in a deeper... I was doing so good. That was almost a flawless read. God damn it. Anyway, let me read that final clause again. Reflect changing conceptions of womanhood in a deeply patriarchal society. There you go. Oh, and bloody hell, there's an even bigger, you know what? I'm going to make this a long news item. I'm going to read this longer blurb. Here we go. Take a breath. This book is part of the Cambria Sinophone translation series, and there's a link to that if you want to look at the whole series. More than 80 years after his death, Liu Nao, born 1905, died 1940. Wow. 35 years old, and I'm 30, so that's a horrible thought. Anyway, more than 80 years after his death, Liu Nao remains a fascinating figure. Liu was born in Taiwan, but early on he wrote that his future lay in Shanghai and did indeed spend the entirety of his glittering but all too brief career in his adopted city, working closely with the small, I don't actually know how to pronounce this word, coterie, a small coterie of like-minded friends and associates as an editor, writer, film critic, scenarist, what is that? Anyway, editor, writer, film critic, scenarist, and director. Liu introduced Japanese, Shinkan Kakuha. Japanese Shinkan Kakuha, new sensationalism, to China, and made it an important school of modern Chinese urban fiction. Now, pause here. I had heard of new sensationalism before. We had a very interesting intro to it in one of the, it was the Moderns mega crossover episode where we did a story by one of the Chinese new sensationalists set in Shanghai. I have forgotten his name, but it was a fantastic story. It was great. I didn't realize it was a genre that had been shipped over from Japan, but I suppose that would be a time when lots of things were being, at least in literature, as far as I know, were being shipped over from modern Japan to modernizing China, or modernizing Japan to modernizing China, whatever. Anyway, continuing, urban scenes. Liu Nao's slim volume of modernist fiction, in particular, has had an outsized influence on Shanghai's image as a phantasmagoric metropolis in the 1920s and 1930s. This collection is especially valuable since there are no more works from Liu, because shortly after producing this, he was murdered, purportedly for political reasons. Maybe he deserved it. Like Japanese new sensationalists who zeroed in on sensory responses to the new technologies rapidly transforming Tokyo after the Great Earthquake of 1923, Liu was fixated on the sights, sounds, and smells of Shanghai, that other throbbing metropolis of the Far East, and these came through in his writings. Liu's urban romances depict, as he himself put it, the bunny quotes thrill and bunny quotes carnal intoxication of modern urban life. His stories take place in Shanghai's nightclubs, racetracks, cinemas, and cafes, sites of moral depredation, but also of erotic allure and excitement. Therein lies the contradictory nature of his urban fiction, which gives us a vivid picture of early 20th century Shanghai. I have to say, all this horny language on an episode about, like what I described in the intro, is making me uncomfortable, but oh well, I committed to reading this blurb. Let's keep going. This complete translation of Liu's seminal work is available for the first time to researchers, students, and general readers interested in modern Chinese literature and culture. This is the boring paragraph, obviously. In addition to the 8 stories in the original urban scenes, this collection includes an introduction by the translators and 3 additional pieces Liu published separately. The translations are based on the first editions of the Chinese texts. Urban Scenes is a valuable addition to collections in Chinese and Sinophone studies. And I would hope people who are not just studying these things and are actually reading them for pleasure, I would hope. But it is an academic book, so I'm going to look at... I know I'm spending far too much time on this, but I'm going to look at... What does this thing cost? Looks like the purchase options aren't... standard paperback edition, softcover, $30. Yeah, that's not exactly economical, is it? And the hardcover's not out yet. So this might be one to get once it becomes available for academic libraries, for all you academics out there. Last thing I'll say, the cover image, you really have to see it to believe it, but we have like a guy, a frighteningly skinny man with wine and playing cards. One of the wine glasses is falling over. playing cars are collapsing to the floor, and there's a lady in some kind of fantabulous gown, opening and flying all over the place, lying on a chair that looks so relaxed, it looks like it could be a beanbag, holding one of them, decorously holding a cigarette. So, and they look like they're bickering or debating something. So, just great stuff. Okay, right, into more austere territory now. News item number 3. This is 7 days old news now, or more than 7 days old, but whatever. It's good stuff. I guess it's a sad story. It's nice to see this author in the news. So some of you may know that the Nobel Literature Prize went out, and the winner was a Norwegian one, Jon Fosse. And it's a pity because, well, it's a pity for Chinese literature or whatever, because relatively long time favorite TrChFic once again did not win. So TrChFic, I'm basically just putting this in the news just to announce it, but also to link to a BBC article. It's just interesting to see good old TrChFic in BBC News. It's pretty cool. If you don't know much about TrChFic and you want to read her stories, you should. If you want a nice supplement to reading those stories, I've got just the one episode on her, a really good one on her I Live in the Slums, which is a relatively recent publication in translation. I was thinking about, like, what do I think her avant-garde stories are, and I feel like she has found a way to describe one of the extended dimensions that exist. I don't know if you've ever heard how quantum physics says there's 11 possible dimensions, and we're only aware of the 3 dimensions of space and time, and those are the only ones we perceive. Well, I think her fiction is like it's a way that describes the other dimension we all live in. You couldn't really call it science fiction. No, you could not. That would be stupid. But she's like unlocked a completely insane way of describing spaces, situations, mental landscapes. She's the queen. She should get that prize. I think if it's a big weighty prize, then that's an author who writes difficult, rewarding fiction who deserves it. It's not a load of pretentious rubbish, is what I'm saying. It's good shit. Okay, last one. This is something you can read. I'd not read this. There's Zippo I can say about it, so this will be a nice contrast to the other news items. It's something you can read. It's published in the New Yorker, readable online. It's a short story by one Shuang Shuetao, translated by one Jeremy Tang. Shuang Shuetao we've not covered him on the show, and I guess we won't before this 100th episode hiatus, but Jeremy sure has. And Jeremy has talked on the show about why Shuang Shuetao was cool and why you should read him. So here's your chance for free. Go take advantage of it. Okay, I apologize if you found this news, this TrChFic news dull. You've got me to blame for deciding to read that great big Leonao blurb. But you know what? I had a bit of fun doing that. That's what matters. And fun will hopefully carry you through this interview. It was an enjoyable talk, but like I said, somber subject matter and a very challenging book. So enjoy the conversation coming up next between me and Jenna Tang, translator of Fang First Love Paradise. So on the show, we have Jenna Tang back once again. It's been quite a while, Jenna. What have you been up to since we did that episode on Far Away?
It's great being back here again, and thank you so much for the invitation, Angus. I've been traveling kind of over the world here and there. I was in Latin America for a while, and then I was back in the US teaching some workshops, giving lectures, and now I'm finally back to Taiwan just to meet some authors and fellow translators. It's been great traveling all around the world, but I'm starting to feel a little tired and wanting to settle.
Yeah, I can imagine. So our book for this episode is one you've translated. It's on its way to publication in translation. It's called Fang First Love Paradise. The author is Lin Yihan. There's a huge amount to say about this one, and I'm not exaggerating. Maybe we can start with this. Who was Lin Yihan and why is she important?
Yeah, so Lin Yihan is the author of Fang First Love Paradise, which was published in 2017 in Taiwan. It's a book that's especially iconic for Taiwan's Me Too movement. It's one of the most Perhaps it's just my interpretation, but perhaps it's like the most well-read book in Taiwan that's about Me Too movement. And this book has a lot to do with gender, a sense of belonging, and the style of the book is such stream of consciousness that shifts between characters' minds, which is really interesting to read. And the way she wrote actually broke a lot of conventions from the traditional writing in Taiwan or kind of beyond the world. And so she's that kind of person. And there's so much vitality from this book that even though unfortunately she's passed, the spirit and there's so much that's about this book that still kind of lingers in this world in a good way. It helps a lot of people talk about their own stories, or it perhaps helps people come to terms with what they've experienced before.
Right, which sort of inevitably leads us to what it was about. I wonder if you'd like to have a go at summarizing the plots, the people, and then maybe if we miss anything on the first pass, we can go into any other little details about what this novel's all about.
Sounds great. Since the book is on its way to be published, I feel like just in general, like the structure of the book is really hard to just summarize it because somehow it feels like we're following the characters' minds and just go with the flow of a story to explore what has happened before and what's happening right now in the story time, and also what now after all that happened. And I guess some of the major characters to identify, first is the Fang, which is on the title as well. She's the protagonist. The story kind of spans between when she was 13 to 16, 18 years old. She's the protagonist who has undergone the sexual assault of her cram school teacher. And as for lèyuán, it's Fang Ziqi's bestie. They spend a lot of times together. They're kind of twin of the souls. However, they live very extremely different lives from each other. For lèyuán, without her realizing it until much later. And the other characters, Xu Yiwen, who's an adult, like a woman who lives kind of like their neighbors, who they like to share literature with. She has been undergoing domestic violence from her much older husband, and there's a lot of those trauma that they shared, although unspoken at times. However, the sentiments were kind of shared in the ambiance of the novel. And as for Chen Yiwei, who's the husband of Xu Yiwen, and who beat her until she got a miscarriage, is this guy who's in this very rich family, who ended up marrying Xu Yiwen. There's a lot to unpack about this character as well. And there's also Li Guohua, who's one of the major characters in this novel, who's also the abuser of Fang Ziqi and so many other girls that are sort of unnamed. I guess it's important to identify all these characters before tuning into the stories. Because story is so stream of consciousness, we sort of, at least for me, like I sort of gravitate towards the characters being established here.
All of them, I guess, some more than others, but all of them are pretty important to the story and the themes. You're so right when you said that Fang Ziqi and Liu Yiting, the two little girls, do come across as being maybe soulmates is maybe a strange thing to say about kids that are friends, but they clearly have a really strong connection. And I guess one of the tragedies of the book is that they drift apart. They sort of at first, Liu Yiting doesn't know why Fang Ziqi is essentially acting up, but she slowly, I think, cottons on something's not right, and it seems to be related to this cram school teacher, Li Guohua. And then by the time she's maybe ready to do something, it's almost, well, perhaps it's too late. And the character Qian, I guess, I don't know if we want to reveal all the plot details, but I guess it's not said explicitly until you've already sort of figured it out, but his abusiveness seems to be tied up with alcoholism. So that's there too. And I guess a thing that stands out to me about several of the characters is like a mixture of, my phone just fell out of my pocket. Whoops. A mixture of economic, either wealth or ambition for some of the adult characters, and for the kids and the adults, there's a sort of ambition or pretensions to like bookishness, intellectualism. The two girls seem to be reading well above their sort of age. Li Guohua, the teacher, acts like he's some big literary, um, enlightened figure or encyclopedia of literary knowledge, and that's part of how he manipulates people, is having that literary persona. And then, I guess in Yuan, the abused wife, she's got, I guess, a more normal or happy relationship with literature, culture. It's something she can talk about with the kids. She's not using it for either selfish ends to further herself in the world, and she's not using it to sort of give herself authority over others. So yeah, I found alongside the sort of Me Too themes, I thought Lin Yihan was doing really interesting things with like a sort of these bookish characters and how that influences their life. But yeah, I guess probably most people listening know what a cram school is, especially in like the context of Taiwan and East Asia. But maybe we could tease that one out a bit more and why those are significant in Taiwan. Because me myself, I've never been to one. I don't know if there's anything you know about them, Jenna.
Yeah, of course. I grew up in Taiwan, and so yes, I've definitely been through the cram school system. Since
Right.
our education is so competitive, like it's a system where we're constantly competing with each other, especially in high schools. And so in high schools, we at least have 9 different subjects to study at school, and to which we constantly have regular exams, to just like each semester we have like about 3 major exams, and we're constantly preparing for quizzes or exams, exams. It's kind of quite a cycle. And to achieve to keep like a better grades and to kind of become outstanding in school, some people choose to go to after school classes, which is the cram school. In the cram school, a lot of times like people go there mainly, primarily, at least in my year, like we all go for English and math. In my case, it's just math.
Mm.
And in those classes, sometimes they offer some package, like before like the college entrance exam, and they have this package and they schedule everything for you. They make sure like you understand every single thing that everyone thought they could grasp. And so we would go to these cram schools, usually after school, even during weekends, and just study there all day or take some extra classes as for reviewing or just to familiarize ourselves with the materials more. So in hopes of, like having more achievements in school and perhaps having more possibility of entering the national colleges, things like that. So such system is established to kind of like quote unquote compensate what we didn't understand in school. And it also serves, for some, it serves like a reassurance, like I've done everything I can
Right.
to establish what's to be established. And so these kind of cram schools earn a lot of money out of parents, students, and it's earning out of this super competitive educational system.
A thing that surprised me is that the character of Li Guohua is like a famous cram school teacher. So when I was out teaching in China, I did teach in a school something like that, but it was for 18 plus. It was like an adults weekday evenings and weekend school. And as a teacher in like a well, I was in Shanghai High School, which has a primary school, middle school, and a high school. So you did see kids doing classes extra. We were in the international division. There wasn't so much of that because the let's just say the exam and homework workload was a bit more Western style. It was quite heavy, but it wasn't really like the hardcore study regime the high school kids in the local division who were doing Chinese style education were doing. So we did have one-on-one extra classes. I did do some of those, but the kids in the local division were studying. It was in the campus, in the classrooms with their teachers who were working extra hours, and they would be going up to about 9 p.m. or something, or maybe 8 p.m. But when it was totally dark outside, so a real high pressure environment. So I had all that sort of secondhand experience of these things. But the idea that you could have like a rock star or a teacher who's well known across the city, I don't know, it seems kind of unique, but it's not really a good thing in this novel because it's something Li Guohua uses for like evil ends, basically.
Yeah, sometimes it can be like a cult because some of the people who went to those cram schools were like me, like I really sucked at math, and there's like almost no way to save whatever grades I could get from math. Like I always get zero or just my little scores. And so for some people who might be like me for certain subjects, they might seek that kind of magic. Like they
Right.
were looking for someone who could tell them any strategies that suddenly just in a click like work for them. And so there are some famous teachers who are, like you said, like rock stars that actually have certain strategies that work for a lot of people, and therefore people follow whatever they say. And it creates kind of this worshipping cultures. And a lot of them actually use nicknames instead of their real names.
Which is fine until no one knows your real
Yeah,
name. Then you've obscured your identity and you're harder to pin down.
exactly.
And you could say change city and change your teacher name, and then
Exactly.
yeah, pretty dark. Definitely like in childhood, I can think of lots of like clubs and extracurricular things I went to, which in hindsight were really not normal environments. Like I was a member of a swimming club, and this maybe had a similar dynamic to a cram school because it was the point of the swim club was to become a competitive swimmer. And that meant, the more you would go to the pool to train, the better you would be. I was only going most of the time I was a member once a week. So I was not really one of the good swimmers. Later, I went twice and then 3 times. And I remember the more I was going, the more I became slightly more connected with the inner circle of these kids. And very often it was the coach's children who had their little inner circle of friends. They were like the sort of core group that you would be in with if you were going regularly. But there was a guy who transitioned from being a swimmer to a coach who became very popular with all the coaches, known by all the swimmers. And it came out a few years later that, yeah, he went on to do, I think it was a PE coaching job in a school somewhere in the city I was from. And he was caught with like pictures of the little girls on his laptop. So like if I try to think of a parallel with these sort of abnormal, closed off environments where a lot of kids are put in the trust of a small group of adults that know, or in this case, not even an adult, just an older kid that no one's watching, you can have these horrific circumstances.
It also informs us just like we grew up sometimes not thinking too much about what's around us, and we're
Mm.
still growing at a time we're not as mature as of now. And there was just so many bullets that were all around. And it happens to be that our one decision or our one action that changes the whole thing, that we're not in a place where we don't want to be. When I translated this book, I often think about that. Just when I was growing up in Taiwan, also, it's such a small community in my town. And if I had made that one decision to stay in one of my cram schools after cram school, something could have happened.
Right. I guess we should say what we've introduced the cast of the book and the main sort of, I guess, the big thing, which is that there's a teacher abusing one of these kids. But I guess the progress, a lot of the progress of the plot is the fact that initially this teacher like manipulates this kid and corners her, abuses her, but then they end up he sort of keeps her and holds on to her in this abusive relationship where he's regularly abusing her as she grows up as a teenager. And then you see how that harms her like psychologically over time. I guess you see her, a lot of it is about that, like how she initially deals with it, how she has to live with it, and then finally when she can't take it anymore, well, what happens when she can't take it anymore, and how what people around her are perceiving. And also we do see a lot of this of the teacher, like it's not like the camera, so to speak, looks away when these awful things are happening, or when they're together where he's like persuading her to come to either his little apartment or some cheap hotel room somewhere, and you see his gross and strange ways of talking and his sort of, it's hard to tell what's an act like set up to impress this kid and what is just his sort of warped worldview, or not warped way of going through life and treating other people.
Exactly. I feel like growing up in Taiwan and just hearing all these things happening to my friends back home, and that it was so close to me physically, and it just happened to not having happened to me. And it just made me think about all these, I don't know, like just all these decisions. It's kind of strange. Like sometimes we do felt this weird vibe, and it's hard to
Mm.
explain. And as teenagers without that much experiences in life, like sometimes it's hard to tell like what was actually weird for us. And now that I heard so much about like the Me Too movement, I've heard about a lot of things that happened to my friends before. And now looking back, I was like, oh, that was the weird vibe I was feeling at the time. It's just I didn't know how to interpret that weirdness.
Yeah. In my high school, we had, let me see, there were two teachers who, after I left, I think were basically exposed for it was male teachers, yeah, abusing the girls that were under their care. And one of the outcomes is much darker than the other. So one of them was an art teacher, and he was a lot like Li Guoha, actually. He had this like sort of he had a funny persona. He was actually quite a funny teacher, and he tried to, well, came across as very quirky. But in hindsight, he was a bit handsy. He would touch quite a lot of the kids like on their shoulders or their hair. And yeah, he ended up going to court and getting sentenced and like not being able to wriggle out of it at all, which, it raises questions about what was going on in that art department. How secret was it? But then there was another guy, and curiously in the music department, so another like arts department rather than say like maths or technology or something. And he never actually got outed in court, but he was known for being weird, especially with the girls. And I heard through, a friend of a friend or something that, yeah, he did actually sleep with I think one of the 18-year-old girls in what, who knows how consensual it was, but he was using his position to do stuff like that. And his mother was the head of the education board in the city.
Oh,
And what happened was he just got transferred to a different school. And apparently that's quite standard, probably around the world. But like my mum told me, she used to work in the NHS, the British, well, I guess Scotland's health service, the NHS Scotland. And whenever you would see someone being moved far away or punished on a strange technicality, like he was charged with fiddling the numbers in the accounts or something technical, but then he got moved far away, and it was almost certainly him being protected by his mother for doing this stuff. So yeah, and it's all stuff that I heard some stuff about that guy in high school, but essentially this is all stuff I found out in hindsight. And it's the things that are parallels with the story here is that it was male teachers, female female kids were the victims, and that it was people. It was all cultural stuff. It was the people in the fun subjects, so to speak. Whether or
wow.
not you think literature is fun is subjective, I suppose. But yeah.
Yeah, I used to have these foreign languages teachers. A lot of them are awesome. They helped me establish like my language proficiency from a very foundational level. But it's just being in that community, we hear things here and there, and I was 15 and I didn't know anything. And I was just with that. I don't know, like it was so close to me, but it just didn't happen to me because my friend liked to interpret this reaction as my survival skills at the time as a teenager without me knowing that it was kind of a survival skills at that time, because the educational system, like we had to go to school like from 7 a.m. to kind of 4 or 5 p.m. and sometimes we stay at school. If we're seniors, we study for entrance exams until like 9 or 10, and then we go back home. We went back home very late.
Jesus, that's crazy.
Yeah, and so at a time for me, I did like perhaps twice cram schools for math because I really sucked. And it's just like when the idea of having already finished my cram school classes until very late at night, and then having to stay over at the cram school for furthermore kind of like one-on-one
Oh,
session was very unappealing to me. So all the time, no matter how much they force me, being potentially a child molester or not, sometimes they just want to keep you there, to make you I don't know, like to make sure that you understand whatever you need to understand. I was just always in this, like the French like to say, "Je la flemme," like I just don't want to do it, and I would just be like, no, I'm just going home. If you can't make me understand in class, I'll just go home. It's all about finding comfort, and I didn't want to spend extra time where I'd be like, there's no life for me.
And it's good that nothing happened to you, because I guess for Fang Siqi, literature is her big passion in life, and it gets poisoned because this literature cram school teacher, he mixes up his weird, well, calling it a relationship might seem really dark, but it really is. He develops this twisted psychological as well as sexually abusive relationship with this kid, but he twists up literature and stuff all with it, so that's poison for her forever. But thankfully for yourself, you were putting all of that, well, whether it was your choice or not, you were putting all that time into foreign languages, and that's become the thing you do. So I guess that's, like you said, you made the right, whether you knew it or not, you were making good choices, and it kept that thing alive for you and not tainted.
Sometimes it does feel kind of unfair. Like, what if I didn't make that decision? I could have ended up very differently right now. And just because these people happen to pass by those paths and just happen to have those things happen to them, and right now live such different lives, it's just like we're all humans. Like, why are things so different for all of us?
I was never, I wouldn't ever say I was abused at that swimming club, but maybe there was probably some bullying. I think it would be safe to say that that guy that was found to be a pedophile did bully the other boys a lot, and it was years and years and years and years before I ever wanted to go into a swimming pool again, because not because I was psychologically messed up, but it wasn't something I associated with fun, which is a shame because I do find swimming quite fun. So yeah, I feel like we probably need to get back onto talking about the book, its literary qualities, and other everything else there is to say. You said the book broke a lot of conventions in Taiwanese lit, but also just in general, it's a pretty experimental book. I definitely agree. But before I go and monologue about that, I wonder, what do you think about the mood and the style, the writing, the structure, all the stuff that is the artistic side of the book? What would you say about it?
Yeah, the mood, to me, it feels like I'm being told a secret. And
Mm.
I'm kind of in this space with the voice of the story, and I'm being told something that I don't know if I could talk about it with other people. And it feels like I'm being entrusted. And the overall kind of narration, the voice of narration novel feels like a very long stream of consciousness. It's almost like they're being told in one breath, but that's just my interpretation. And there's so much, I guess I said it breaks convention is because unlike many novels, like it's not tracing back to the past and coming back and forth or being chronological. It's more like there's a lot of things, it's like piecing the memories together. And we're not, we kind of roughly know like where we are in the story time, but then we're constantly wondering like where are we in time? But somehow I feel like that kind of disorientation of time is what we need to feel to align with the mood of the novel. And there's so much that sometimes we're visiting the past and sometimes we're visiting kind of the current times. And then there's more to just guessing like what has happened to other people. It's all, I don't know if we can call that fragmental, but it feels like puzzles. And we're sorting up these puzzles and trying to put them together at different places. And sometimes we switch places and we're like, oh, this happened before this. And we're constantly figuring out what's happening. Um, it's kind of how I feel when I translate and when I read this novel.
Yeah, the opening scene, so to speak, of the book, I think is a good example of that. Where, from what I remember, we have Fang Siqi's family and Liu Yiting's family are at a meal together, and Fang Siqi makes some kind of what is it? She's got some long vegetable, and she makes some kind of joke about how eating it is like giving a blowjob, and she's what, like, she's really young. It's not a joke you'd ever make with your family, and it's a weird thing for like someone who's really just still a kid. You couldn't really even call her a young adult to make, and I think it's you. I don't know. you might say it's subtle, but I think anyone who's got knows a little bit about how abused kids can behave, it's like it indicates maybe something's her sense of boundaries are dissolved, or she's mentally, maybe it's a cry for help, or maybe, I don't know, she's been sort of knocked askew by the abuse in such a way that she might be making out strange outbursts like this quite a lot. And then I guess the other implicit tragedy there is no one really knows to interpret it that way. They just think she's being rude. But if you've read the blurb, if you know the premise of the book, you know that you're being thrown into a situation probably where this kid's already been abused. But then we sort of work backwards to how that happened.
Yeah, there's so much black humor in that very first scene. And also
Yeah.
that sea cucumber, like that image is
Right.
kind of, I wonder if that's also projecting like the poop. Because there's so much mentioning about like the poop in the story. And somehow it maybe informs a little bit of like how in Taiwan people like to make fun of things like that. And it's sort of a culture, and it sort of softens things a little bit when things are getting very serious. So I don't know if there's perhaps the intention of that kind of humor coming in. I thought that scene was really funny for me, even though I know there's something more heavy kind of hiding behind what was happening on the page. And there's so much irony to that scene as well, just like how adults care so much about wealth and their economic strength, and somehow being able to bring their kids to that kind of high-rise hotel and being able to have like those precious gemstone like seafood means something at some point. And for them, it was something to play with, and it didn't know as much as those adults do. And so it somehow also projects like what was coming or what has just happened.
Man, there's so many replies I could make to that. I'll make a mental note to talk about humor. But another thing that's reminded me of is how it felt like in the book, it wasn't that there was a sort of a moral, it wasn't just a sort of amoral tale of something often awful that happened to someone. It did feel like it was trying to shed light on something and make a point about something. And obviously condemn Li Guohua, the pedophile teacher, but I felt like there was also a really big condemnation of that, I guess, the elder generation or his generation, because there's multiple scenes in the book where like Fang Zixi's mom or dad or someone has a chance to pay attention, intervene, help their kid, give a shit basically, and they never do.
Yeah.
Like there's an awful scene. I don't know if it's Fang Ziqi or if it's the other girl we briefly meet, Cookie, but she tries to tell the parents what's happening, just straight up. She's brave enough to do it, and she's told that she's like brought it on herself, and that that it's her fault basically, and that she's disgusting. And maybe other things that that generation do in the story aren't as overt, but I'm pretty sure this novel ends on a gathering of that generation, and they're just talking about like what property prices, how well people have done in their career, nothing about like the lives that have been ruined that they either are aware of and are choosing to ignore, or should have been aware of if they were perceptive enough.
Exactly.
So it's not like they're blameless and they weren't smart enough to see what was going on.
Yeah, there's so much, like you said, there were so many opportunities where they could have intervened. But it just by how much, like for example, Fang Zixi's parents appeared, or how many times the other parents could have interfered, any adults. It just talks about when experiences like this was taking place at a time, or when things were happening, and the person who's experiencing it can't really figure out what was actually happening on them. It talks about that solitary experience. Like you feel like you're constantly alone, and sometimes you want to talk about it, but it's hard to talk about for sure. And then people kind of tell you to go with the flow because they don't see what's happening right away, and somehow that becomes quite a toxic cycle. It just goes on, and I feel like it's also talking about that kind of experience and that sentiment.
Yeah.
That if people try to be there with you, but you just don't know how to let them be with you.
Mm-hmm. I remember hearing from Chinese friends my own age when I was living in in China that when in high school or whenever they were supposed to in the curriculum get sex education, maybe not anything about like safety from abusive people, but just basic stuff about, yeah, what's going to happen to you as you turn from a kid into an adult. And often the teachers would skip the pages. They'd say, okay, we're going to, I think maybe in so many words, they would say, we'll pretend we did this bit, you guys do your homework instead. So it felt like a lot of people who would have been like my age, and maybe the younger kids as well, were just where I was growing up in Scotland, was getting lots of education on, well, basic sex education, but also like how to avoid dangerous adults. Like, you know, they told us early on, you know, don't get lured into a car as small kids, and then later, you know, you get told what it could really be about. Although probably there's probably less of that than I remember, but there was certainly a lot of that safety and awareness built into the curriculum. I got the sense, at least for other other millennials in China, anything that wasn't studying your core subjects was a very, very low priority. I don't know if it was similar in Taiwan for your generation, but I got the sense that, yeah, no one really had the language or the awareness to understand what a guy like Li Guohua was doing.
Yeah, especially at the time when I was in high school, like we did have sex education, but it felt very kind of like superficial level. Like we're being introduced to birth control and we're being introduced to how condoms are being used. But a lot of those are kind of it's not enough. Like there's no establishment of how to be aware or alarmed for something that could have threatened us or threatened our mental health. And there's so much that's about scaring us. Like, I have my cousin who was having the sex education in school, also in high school, and the teacher basically played this video of a woman getting an abortion, and everything
Whoa.
in blood, everything in colors.
What?
It was very disturbing, and
Jesus.
some of them were being told they could just, like cover their eyes and something like that. But most of now that we're thinking back about it, it feels like it's a lot about scaring us. Like you shouldn't have sex at this age, you should focus on your studies. And if you get pregnant, this might be the consequence. It's so much scaring us that no matter what happened, we didn't know how to say it. Even though, things happen, some people get pregnant, some people have other issues. But we just have this system that really suppress us for telling people what happened to us, and everything seems like a secret. And even just things as simple as having like intercourse, even just kissing someone, making out with someone, is so, we have to be so secretive about it, because otherwise people talk. And as teenagers at that time, like people care about, like we all care about what people think of us or how people perceive us. There's so much self-consciousness and awareness around that line. So yeah, so the sex education never teaches us how to protect ourselves. Like the protecting is really just like, don't get pregnant.
Abstinence. Yeah, interesting. The thing they tried to really scare us about in primary school, especially, and secondary school, was fire and drugs. They wanted you to understand if you didn't turn off all your electrical devices before you went to bed, you would die in a fire while you were sleeping. And if you ever smoked weed once, well, maybe it wasn't that extreme, but they gave us a lot of warnings about those things. I'm curious if kids in Scotland are getting scared about fire as much as we were. I don't know. But yeah, the stuff about sex ed, it was not, now that I think of it, there maybe wasn't a huge amount about like abuse or anything, but definitely it didn't have that negative component, or if it did, it was a way less extreme.
Yeah, I just remember like one of those classes I took in junior high school. So when I was about 13, 14, one of the teachers said to us that the girls shouldn't wear short skirts in case someone like see you as a target. And then she also kind of emphasized that if girls have this ponytail, it's easier for whatever abusers to like you. So it scared us so much that at the time I was also kind of a ponytail girl, that I just like didn't want to wear ponytail anymore, because it was like, oh, am I just making myself a target? and we didn't know too much. So we were like, oh, what should we actually do and what should we not do? We didn't know.
Yeah, that's giving you all the wrong priorities and probably giving you a complex about. I mean, I have long hair. That's a very useful thing to do with your hair. Sometimes you need to tie it back. It's terrible that you'd be getting terrified every time you need to do that.
Yeah, one of the things that might be missing is like the self-defense courses, just so
Right.
know how to actually protect ourselves when things are actually happening.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to try and take us back to the book. Oh yeah, humor, irony, black humor. That feels really important. I can bring this back again to that art teacher at my school. He had like this sense of humor that seemed very similar to Li Guohua. And I don't know if you've ever read the American novel Lolita. The narrator, I guess a lot of people know, but that's a story narrated by the abuser. Basically, he like essentially manipulates and abducts this girl who must be, what is she, like 12 or something, and essentially abuses her. But it's all from his perspective. And one of the things that makes it so readable, aside from that like thing that you feel that you're getting the inside picture of very dirty secrets, is that he has like a really weird, skewed way of thinking, behaving, talking. He is kind of funny. He is weirdly, maybe not charming, but like it's the narrative really pulls you in. And I'm not sure if I have like a really deep understanding of why it seems like these kind of men are like that. I wonder if it's because a way for them to live with or rationalize what the nastiness of what they're doing is to sort of write everything off as a joke. If you're abusing some poor kid and ruining her life, it doesn't matter if it's all just not serious and a joke, and maybe she should find it funny too. And I don't know, I do think one of the strong things about the book is that the irony and the black humor is in there, and sometimes there are kind of amusing things about very depressing or bleak situations, and it feels like it even creeps into Fang Siqi. See, she's at points, from what I remember, it seems like she thinks everything is a big joke. If I remember right, occasionally she just bursts out laughing. Is that right?
Yeah, it's I guess like the legal Hua's kind of logic. It's like so. It seems like as readers and reading all these contents, it feels like it's so obvious that this is so weird. But
Mm.
I guess from the other perspective, like sometimes like you just don't know. Like we only know so much and we're just trying to like get along with this person. And we didn't think we didn't overthink. And I guess people try to make sense of other people sometimes. That it's really hard for us to like being in that situation, it's really hard for us to just be like, oh, that's weird. So many different things, emotions, different background context like kicks in. So it's really hard to just say, oh, why is this so obvious? And you didn't notice. You just don't notice it at a time.
Yeah, I guess one of Li Guohua's tactics you see in the book is that he's trying to destroy any kind of normality that
Yeah.
Yi Wei, or not Yi Wei, Fang Siqi can you sort of use as a stable ground to sort of get some self-awareness and perspective on the situation she's in. While you were talking, I was flicking through my copy of the book to see if I could find any weird thing that Li Guohua says or does, and I found a bit that I think is a good example of, I don't know if you could call it gaslighting, but like this way he sort of tries to undermine anytime Fang Siqi tries to get a handle on the situation. So if you don't mind, I'll read this little bit here.
Yeah.
There's nothing too gross in it, thankfully. Li Guohua asks, so Suchi has just told him that I think that she's got holes in her memory, that basically she's psychologically suffering and she wants to do something to fix it. So he says, Li Guohua asks Suchi, would you like to go to a counseling session? Do you want to tell the psychiatrist something? What would the counselor learn from you? I won't say anything, Suchi said. All I want is to be able to sleep well and remember things. How long has this been going on? Maybe 3 to 4 years? How come you said nothing about it these past years, and now you want to see a psychiatrist? From what you've told me, you're completely abnormal, Li Guohua said. Suchi replied slowly, because I didn't know if it was just me. This made Li Guohua laugh. Normal people aren't like that. Staring at her fingernails, Suchi continued. Normal people also don't do what we do. Li Guahua fell into silence. Silence was just the tip of an iceberg. Underneath it were words that were 10 times colder. And then he says, "Are you trying to pick a fight with me? Why are you so disobedient today?" And yeah, it's, I guess you're seeing Suchi realize, becoming older and having gone through this abuse for years, and I guess gradually some kind of awareness is building up. And she's, I guess she can't really physically fight back. Psychologically, she's still more or less under his thumb. So you get scenes like this where she's trying to strike back in some way, but I guess everything just bounces off because Li Huahua won't take her. And the only thing it seems like he'll take seriously is getting what he wants and staying out of trouble. And nothing else is really something he cares about.
Yeah, there's so much in this novel that's also about the grooming, like sexual grooming. It's one of those things that's a little less talked about in terms of talking about sexual violence and Me Too movement. It's this sexual grooming for minors or for people who have less experiences in sexual intercourse, where there's this logic from the abuser, just regardless of gender. This abuser setting up this logic to get the consent from the other party, and therefore the other party somehow is being taught something they weren't familiar with, and it's sort of became ingrained in them. So when it comes to if they've consented or not, yes, they did consented, but they didn't know too much to fight back whatever logic that was coming their way. And so that makes it a sexual grooming. And there's a tendency that could happen to more teenagers because we're less experienced in identifying what makes sense and what doesn't make sense in terms of like romantic intercourse and romantic relationships. Like anything could happen. Like we could have been taught any ways possible, and that's actually dangerous. And it feels like, especially in this novel, it talks a lot about this, but people have been talking about, oh, this is a book about sexual violence. Yes, it is also about sexual violence, but it's a lot about this grooming, this kind of brainwash. There's so much to unpack, honestly.
Yeah. I didn't write a formal question about this, but you mentioned this is like a really widely read book in Taiwan. Is the general sort of interpretation of what it means and its significance similar to what we've been talking about, or do Taiwanese or do readers in Taiwan have any other sort of common takes on it that are a bit different from what we've talked about so far?
Yeah, a lot of the things I heard from, say, friends or people I met in Taiwan, when it comes to talking about this book, they're like, "Oh, I didn't dare open the book. I don't know what coming for me." And because Taiwan is such a small place, even though we're sort of spread out in our ways, but it's still a very small island. So there's so many places that could have just been like next door for us, or we could have gone there when we were in college. We could have gone there when we're at work in another city. So it's in such proximity that it scares a lot of people. That it's just like hearing like your neighbor got raped by someone and it was so close to you. It's that kind of horror, which is relatable, but it never really forms like the reason to actually not read this book, because it's important to understand what kind of consequence things might bring and what kind of environments we're actually exposing ourselves to. It's so important to at least be aware and be careful if possible.
So I guess a thing people who won't read the book, people who do read the book have in common is that they both think it's real stuff. This is like a book about real situations. It's not like for example, to compare it again with Lolita, I feel like in Lolita it feels a little bit removed from realism because this main guy, he's called Humbert, so he's got already not a real name, and the situations get increasingly bizarre. The other characters are, I don't know, if anything like that happens in reality, it doesn't feel like it's a normal sort of abuse or world of abusers. But like, yeah, in reading Fang Siqi's First Love Paradise, it felt to me, having never spent more than a few days in Taiwan, having never been a kid in Taiwan, yeah, I felt that it's intended to be some kind of a reflection of reality and not just this one fantastical case. I kind of thought from the title First Love Paradise, is this going to have like a almost magical realist dimension? And I don't think it did. Definitely gets bizarre, and the literary style is very unique. But yeah, it felt like it had an anchor in lots of people's realities growing up in Taiwan.
Yeah, the way I see the title, especially the word paradise, is that it's a kind of a world that could be in our head, or that could be just our own world, the world we created, or a world that's created for us. And I see it that
Mm.
way, and I see it as it's hard to like it's just been all these ideas like juggling around in my head. Um, kind of lost my stream of thoughts, but yeah.
Easily done. I guess the other thing about the title there, First Love, it's I was thinking about this, I forget when, but something you said that made me think another tragedy for Suchi is that as well as sort of her relationship with literature being poisoned by her teacher, her relationship with romance is poisoned. Like I think there are a couple bits in the book where like other boys at her school seem to be somewhat interested in her. I think one in a very sort of, appropriate for his age sort of way asks her out or something, and she can't she doesn't want to be anywhere near it because I guess that side of her has been so completely derailed. It's not even like conscionable to have an innocent, normal teenage courtship with another boy her own age because she's in another world, not a nice world, but she's in a different dimension from that boy who's presumably not been exposed to anything like what she's being exposed to.
Exactly. And something that's interesting in a novel is that there's constant presence of, for example, Buddha or Guan Yin
Mm.
kind of necklace that's in Fang Ziqi's dream, and she didn't know at first like what she was experiencing. Was that reality? Was that a dream? And so she dreamt about like the father, and then there was the teaching assistant and all that, and it was all like mixing together. And there's so much presence, like for example, between the bookshelves, there's like the casual guanyin, and then there was all these like very sacred kind of like things like people worshipped, the gods, deities, and they're constantly looking at what's happening like in the room, like Xu Yiwen being abused by her husband and Fang Ziqi being abused by the teacher. And I remember there were passages Fang Ziqi kind of talked about like we have all these gods and deities around us, but none of them actually help me. And if there's actually a god, he's not doing anything to help me. And sometimes I do kind of play around in my head, like, does that say something about the idea of paradise? Like having all these like godlike figures, deities, being there, at least they're protecting you, but they're just being there. And all in all, like the paradise seems to be like a world that's separated from the rest of the things that's familiar to everyone.
Mm. And then sort of even literally because whenever Li Guohua is, he's wants to abuse these girls, he almost never wants to be seen on the street with them. It's always got to be in his little apartment or in some hotel room. So they are these tiny little boxes that these things happen in. I think you mentioned there the abusive marriage. We didn't really talk anything about that. So there's a sort of parallel plot that follows Yuan, the wife of this abusive husband. Do you think that's sort of deliberately in there, showing you how a grown woman can be, I guess, more physically abused than sexually abused? Like, why do you think it's in the book?
I think it's trying to talk about different kinds of abuse that could happen every day, just we don't notice, and it could possibly not happening to us. It could happen to other people, and how these things kind of back to back happen to two separate people, but somehow they're under similar under similar circumstances. They couldn't really talk about it, but it just kept happening to them. It's talking about a toxic cycle, and it could, and I guess if we really talk about it as a parallel, like for Fang Ziqi, it's like when abuse like this happens to a teenage girl, and how does that entice? And if something happens to a mature mature women, not being like emotionally mature, but more like just age-wise, people would call people at that age more mature. Just how things can be. And one is more sexual abuse, and one is also sort of sexual abuse, but there's more of domestic violence and psychological gaslighting. It somehow applies to both actually, but just they react so differently. And they're both in very different situations. And I guess in a way, it's bringing our awareness to how abuse takes in so many different shapes and forms, and how there are some commonalities that could be shared by survivors, but still they have their own stories, and people take different initiatives to survive and to fight with whatever they had to fight with.
I guess I mean it's not a very original or difficult point, but one of the abusers is her husband, and then for Suchi it's her teacher. So these are, you know, people, or not just people, but men who are supposed to, you know, help you, support you. You put a lot of trust in them. The person you've married should be someone you're always safe with. And if you're a kid, your teacher isn't supposed to be your parent, but in an ideal world, your teacher is someone you should never have to feel frightened around, who should be helping you in life. And they're both destroying the lives of these people that have placed all this trust in them. Not an original thought, but I guess it's just part of what makes it so sad.
Yeah, and also
yeah.
at the same time, it kind of breaks the stereotypes. At least it used to be a stereotype in Taiwan where like rape happens when you like wear short skirts, shorts, and you happen to be in this dark alley and you get pulled away. But the reality is that it's not always like that. There's a lot of familiarity of people around us that play into it, and that familiarity is actually what makes it more dangerous because we just trust them. And things happen, and sometimes it's like boundary being crossed, but sometimes not everyone knows how to really like speak out all the boundaries and all the things to between different people. But then things just keep happening. And I guess it's talking about what is the actual reality of any sexual abuse or any forms of abuse taking place in everyday life.
Yeah. I guess this thing I remember about Yuan getting abused by her husband Yue is that it feels, those scenes in my mind feel quite different from the ones where it's Li Guohua abusing Suchi, because those situations are so bizarre and twisted, and Li Guohua is, you know, eccentric. He's eccentric. A lot of the time we use eccentric in like a fond way to mean someone who's kind of cute. He's a nasty eccentric, but like he's a weird dude. Whereas with Yue, Chen Yue and Yuan, it's very mundane. Like it there's nothing very unusual or odd. It's like this guy who comes home drunk and beats up and then possibly rapes his partner. And there's nothing, it's not like you could get very much out of doing psychoanalysis on this guy. He's just a shithead, basically.
And there's so much of like the way readers experience that violence with a character, it's kind of like it's being muted. It's like when Iwa was going through something with Iwei, like we can't really see exactly like chronologically what's happening, but something happened to her. It's like a slap, like a beat. It's like boom, here it is. Boom, here it is. And it also talks about how we find out things in reality when abuse has taken place. It's always like something happened and then it suddenly became kind of what's being talked about between people, or we just didn't realize during all this time these kind of things were happening to someone. I feel like the reading experience itself is informing that kind of reality as well, at least to me.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, sort of things being obscured from your view. I guess my next question is something we already talked about a bit, but maybe we could hit on it like more directly. And it was about whether how like specific this story is. So I was saying before, I felt that reading Lolita, it didn't feel very generalizable because it was so bizarre and idiosyncratic. But this story, we already said it seems to have some kind of grounding in reality. But I wanted to get your point of view on how universal you think it is. Like, is this a story about abuse in Taiwanese cram schools specifically? Would it be generalizable to like the study extracurricular cram schools in like neighboring countries like mainland China, Japan? Or do you think this is just a Me Too story for the world, like for little girls everywhere, or even not just for little girls, for all women, or even for all people? Like, what do you? I don't think there's one easy answer, but what's your point of view on that?
Yeah, so I feel like Me Too stories, it could be a story about abuse, it could be anything that's talking about genders, anything the writer's tackling that's about gender, sexual abuse, sexual violence, and so on. It's a topic that's easily forgotten if it's already being talked about by some other stories or by some other incidents. People talked about it and then it put it down for a little bit, and that putting down makes it look like it's being forgotten. So we need this kind of stories to come over and over from different cultures. As we just talked about, like the abuse can take place in many systems in many different shapes. It's important to recognize that and to acknowledge the existence of so many different forms of abuse and to learn how we cope with it in a more positive light, as much as it's heavy and as much as sometimes there's just no easy way to cope with it. It takes time and it takes a lot of efforts to tackle. So we need this kind of stories to keep bringing people's awareness and attention because we're a forgettable being. And it's one of those topics that cannot be forgotten. So people keep writing about it. And as we move along with time, like more people are more outspoken about things that happen to them, which takes a lot of courage, and it's very admirable to decide to speak up about something like this. So I guess the universal element for me are these, like people like tides, they keep talking about it and they keep having these waves hit back to the beach. And just that these kind of stories being told like as if it's in one breath.
Hmm. Yeah, you've reminded me, we have something like this going on right now in the UK, a TV celebrity who was big through the noughties, so the 2000s, as like I guess he had a rock star persona, funnily enough, but it was essentially a TV personality, although he did have an autobiography that was somewhat famous. It's Russell Brand. He went on to become, for a while, sort of posturing himself as like a vaguely lefty revolutionary figure, and then that gradually morphed into being a YouTuber pushing like vaguely right-wing conspiracy theories. But the thing that I guess is universal there, I would say, is a guy using charm rather than power. Although he was very wealthy, apparently he was silencing women using like lawyers essentially. So I guess there was power there for wealth, but like manipulation through charisma, power. He didn't. I guess he did also have an institution backing him. He was with the BBC and I guess other TV channels, and it's not really known just quite how much a blind eye was turned. But it feels like another common thing, whether it's Taiwan, UK, anywhere, alongside power is institutions, where like in Fang First Love Paradise, we get a really dark, I think, scene where you see almost like behind the scenes at the cram school, and it's a like a horrifying situation where basically all the male teachers are scheming to like try and have sex with their teenage girl students and are trying to outdo each other, and the one that's sort of setting it all up is a female teacher who is, I guess, has her own sordid psychology and is doing nothing about it. I don't know how realistic that is, but it sort of paints the problem as not just being about individuals and not just the power of individuals and the trust that is put in them, but the power the institution has and the trust people put in the institution. And links to my the swimming club story as well, where you had all the authority and the charisma was in the hands of like the coaches' kids and sort of the coaches as well. And even if they didn't know what was going on, all that trust was placed in this guy that put himself in that inner circle. So, and I guess the thing about Me Too that I guess I don't know about in Taiwan, but it seems like the thing that allows it to happen is strength in numbers, because if one person makes an allegation against Li Guohua, maybe it doesn't go anywhere. But as soon as, say, 10 people do make an allegation against a person like that, it's safer for another 11th person, and so on. I guess we never really see that in this story, but it's
Yeah,
like you said,
exactly.
it's the importance of telling the stories.
Yeah, also you mentioned that there's so many teachers that are scheming against all these little girls at cram school. I feel like even though in the story sometimes it might look like it's like kind of exaggerated, how can like one cram school have all these teachers all together?
Mm.
But to me, when I read it, I was interpreting more as having these institutions where everyone did something to make that abuse more easier to happen to someone. And it isn't necessarily about scheming together, but more about them not caring about this person thinking crookedly. Or this person, for example, earns a lot of money for the cram school. So they're like, you do whatever and we'll support you, kind of things. And such a system that's built up actually makes it a bigger reason to harm someone further. Because no matter where they go, like nobody will believe them, even though things happen to someone. And I feel like those, even if there's exaggeration for someone's for our reading experience, it might be informing us about that.
Yeah, like these closed off little worlds where these messed up things become normalized and people look another way. I mean, it really helps explain characters like Harvey Weinstein. I'm sure, lots of people must have known what he was doing before enough people were coalesced to make allegations against him. Similar, I guess, with a figure like Jeffrey Epstein, who was hobnobbing with literally the most powerful people in the world and was able to get away with it for so long. And I think, like you said, if there wasn't a culture where these things become normalized and where the ability to shut down anything to invade that culture forms, then yeah, it's man, my thoughts have fallen apart. I can't really tie a neat bow on that, but yeah, I think you see it with those teachers, and like you said, even if it's a bit larger than life, it shows you how the sort of a culture of corruption and whether you call it evil or whether you call it just not no morality whatsoever, giving a shit about those things goes out the window, caring about your students goes out the window. You maybe wonder, what if one of those teachers had not been in that toxic environment? Would he have turned into a more normal, good teacher? Was he corrupted by the environment, or was he always like that as an individual? I guess it's a philosophical question, but yeah, abusers can be shaped by an abusive environment.
Yeah, it is. It also speaks back to that cram school system. It's so different from because they're basically for profit, while the school does also earn profits from students. But usually, if we go to like public school, like the teacher are kind of just paid to teach us, and we're not going there for extra classes because that's our official education. And these cram schools, they do everything to think about strategies to attract more students, to attract more people to come there and do so they can earn money. And so that scheme might also be for profit as well, depending on how to define a profit. And such system also talks about like I remember just being in those cram schools when I was much younger, and all these teachers, because they try so hard to put together some kind of things that would convince us that they're great and we can trust them, that sometimes things just didn't make sense. I was like, this is such a cult.
Mm.
And in general aren't very into cults because I don't know, it's just something off. I always feel something off with cults. And cram school oftentimes give me like a sense of cult. Like if you believe us, then you will get saved, like you get good grades, things like that. But I didn't believe that because it's more about just us figuring out our ways, and sometimes something along the way might happen to help us. And we're just trying to give us more options sometimes. So things like that. And it feels like because it's such kind of like a bonus class, they try so hard to give us something, and they try so hard to create this new logic for us to follow along. But of course, not everyone can follow along, and some people find something makes sense and they try to follow along and somehow and like receives different consequences. Who knows?
Right. I thought we could move to the next section where we talk a little about yourself. So you're the translator of the novel. What led you to translate it, or how did that come about?
It was 2020. I read this book much longer before. It was published in 2017, and I read it right after I came back from France. I was doing 1 year exchange, and I came back to Taiwan. Read the book. I didn't understand too much because I was so young. It was something very unfamiliar to me, but I tried to understand what's inside there. There's that sense of interiority that I kind of echo with, and the voice stays in my mind, even though it's such a heavy book. But I was, it's kind of weird to say, but I was kind of like a sucker for books that talks about trauma because I have my own trauma to deal with, even though it's a completely different story. You were talking about school bullying, and having these images of some memories that brought you back to certain space. I share that experience too. And so I read that book, and in 2018, I was off to New York to study my MFA program. After 2 years, I was looking for a lot of internships, and I was finding myself getting more involved in literary translation. And so people have been asking me, what do you think you would translate? And that was the first book that suddenly just came to my mind.
Oh, wow.
So in 2020, during the pandemic, everyone was at home, and I started translating this novel because I don't know, there's something, even just like the visual space on the book, that kind of just, I just felt like I wanted to translate the whole book, and I want to become the translator of this novel. And somehow that sense of motivation just propels me to translate the whole book. And I was so emerging at a time, I was like, I might as well translate the whole book. And so I did. And then I started pitching it. I started getting mentorship program from Alta and so on and so forth. And after 3 years, it finally brought me to this place where I know that this book is getting published soon.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, you got the one you wanted. That's fantastic. And I have to say it's a really nice translation. So I hope loads of people read it in English.
And I guess it's this experience of having been bullied in school before. I was kind of like an ugly duckling when I was in high schools. And so in senior high school, I was fine. But before that, I constantly get bullied for various reasons. Some things just happened. And so there's a part of me that wanted to fight with that feeling that at that time I didn't know much. And all I did was being bullied. But then I grew up to a different person. And constantly when I thought back about what happened to me, even though it's not like the bullying that really pushed me to a certain extent, did something to myself, but still it wasn't a pleasant experience. And I constantly think about, what if I could travel back in time? How would I protect myself? If I could become like a separate person from my teenage self, I could still be like this and go back to that time. What would I do? And just thinking about all these things kind of gave me a sense of empowerment. It feels like now I have the strength to change something or to change my perspectives about looking at these things. And I think it's these perspectives of wanting to change something, even though we can't really go back to the past. But I really want to do something regarding like when people talk about sexual violence, and I want to speak up about something. And it's that sense of motivation that really brings me to this book, because there's so much that's like not just in our Taiwanese educational system, but I heard just so many stories from different parts of the world, like things like this happen all the time. And I'm just like, why are things always ended up in nothing or ended up in a limbo, and then it's somehow dissipated. And of course nobody can really, not one individual can do something to really change the whole thing. It's always collective, or people supporting each other and trying their best to change the system, but it still takes so much time. But it's always good to think about, like, there's something you could do, even though it's just so tiny step and tiny bit of things, but perhaps it feeds something more positive in the future. Maybe I'm just being too optimistic, but I guess it's that sense that I really want to change something. I want to allow some kind of transformation to exist through literary works or even through translation.
I'm sure it makes a lot of sense. I think maybe it's hard to imagine a world where we humankind completely wipes out all abuse, but bearing in mind everything we said about like institutions and how they can become sort of nasty things can be normalized, it's equally possible to make a society or places like schools, industries like the movie industry or whatever, more hostile places to abuse, either because people working in them would know to spot an abuser and point them out, point their colleague out, or even, as you know, say like as I know, say actresses in Hollywood or kids, little girls in schools, if they're informed and they know about how to defend themselves and call out someone who tries something on them, then yeah, you've made it an environment that's more hostile to abuse, and then hopefully a place where the lèyuán of this world wouldn't feel like they had a free pass to do whatever they wanted. So yeah, I mean, and because probably there's no magical wand you can wave to make that happen overnight, it's these tiny little things that should hopefully make a difference somehow cumulatively. So yeah, it's not, I don't think it's in vain at all.
Yeah, hopefully just more of these things get more open. But I guess it depends on the context. Sometimes it is very sensitive, like people don't want to share, which is understandable. But I feel like it's just so important to keep talking about it. And as much as I guess like one of the things I really hated when I was being bullied back in school, it's for other people who are involved in any of those bullying to tell me to ignore them. Because if ignorance or any kind of ignoring can really do something, I could have already done it. But that just didn't happen. So it's not about ignoring something or not. It's about actually being aware of something and then do something.
What you said about wanting to go down into this project during lockdown, I don't know about you, but I found for myself during lockdown, I felt inclined to take all my reading and my interest down to like more gloomy, weird places. I felt it was I don't know, I was reading the darkest, most depressing, upsetting stuff I could, and because things were so abnormal at that time, and because we had so much time, I don't know, I did explore things that I maybe wouldn't have explored, like right now, where I'm back to Monday, Friday working week, wake up in the morning, go to sleep at night, normal reality. The sort of pause on reality, I think, gave me some permission to follow my interests a bit further than I normally would. I don't know if that was the same for you, or if it was more just having the time to work on the translation.
That was part of it, yes. Like I did have more time for translation. And on the other hand, I did also take interest in a lot of disturbing and surreal kind of works. And I don't know why, I also just wanted my sense of imagination to run wild and see what can happen. So at the time I read so much work that's about like spirits, ghosts, any ghost stories, legends. Everything interested me because I guess being in a closed up space makes me yearn for something that's not gonna be my reality, at least not now. And I want myself to be like I could go anywhere, at least in my mind. That's me.
Totally. I think it was during that time I decided my favorite types of literature are definitely sci-fi and horror. And that I might like before that, if someone asked me what do you like to read, I would have said, oh, a bit of this, bit of that. And I would feel some obligation to enjoy literary, realistic stuff just as much as like, I don't know, a horror novel or something. But I've come out the other side. Maybe it's just part of getting older, but I've come out the other side quite happy to say, yeah, I like stuff that's not about reality. I don't care enough about reality to be reading. I get enough in reality in my daily life to be also reading about it every day. But we're going a bit off topic, so I want to ask you another question about your translation. Did the book present any sort of technical translation challenges, or besides from technical language issues, how about like pitching it, since the topic is so heavy? Did either of those things come up, technical challenges or explaining the subject matter?
Yeah, I think one of the most challenging things in novel, like technically, is also like the lèyuán, the classical Chinese,
Oh, right.
incorporated in a lot of parts. And I guess those things like sometimes they're being interpreted by the protagonist's perspective. So it's not necessarily just word by word kind of meaning from those texts, So I had to look back at those texts over and over just to make sure what's the original meaning and what does it apply? How does it apply to this context right now? There's a lot of thinking about that, and there were so many moments I was afraid they might slip over just by my English translation. So I discussed with a lot of peers just how would you interpret this? Or do you see it as having this other meanings, things like that. I remember I was working on lèyuán's one of her prose where she quoted Liu Zongren's poetry. And then she was using this mirror saying that, oh, in the mirror, if you read from the other's chronology, it's the same meaning. And I was just like, what? It's just how did you see that? And there's so much thinking about that. As for pitching, what was most challenging, I think, was that some of the publishers don't really accept submissions or projects from
Right.
these authors. And so there was a lot of things I couldn't really speak for her because she's the author. And a lot of people say it's too delicate, or it is in a format that is not familiar to everyone. It's not those conventional chronology. And so sometimes people weren't able to piece together that puzzle. So they're like, I'm not sure if it makes sense to me. And to be fair, I think it's like not every novel is for everyone. So everyone has their ways of reading different stories. So it was quite hard, and it took me almost 2 years to pitch this project, but I was so happy that Alexa ended up accepting the submission and we're able to work together on this project. It's been such a joy, and there's so much, even though it is a challenge, but there's so much about talking about wordplay in this novel. That was so much fun during the editing process. And I truly enjoy that. There's just so much. I feel like when I encounter readers who understand the humor, the dark humor inside this novel, that's when I feel like, oh, these are the readers who actually did get a gist of a story. But that's just me. And in a way, it is heavy, but those humor, like wry humor, actually had a lot of fun with it, especially when I translated it. Because it's those kind of logics that's in a way like doing their storytelling, but it's also bringing you some kind of secret that's quite vicious and quite cynical. Yeah, there's just so much about it. And even though it's a long process and there were times I feel like probably nobody's gonna publish this, we don't know. But I'm just really excited and really happy that it's finally coming to fruition.
Hmm. What you said about it being sort of cynical or vicious, I do think, and maybe we already said this, but I think one thing I really liked about the book was it's not written just as like it's not written as a sob story where it's just one big tragedy. You do get, it feels like very frank. I guess it's a lot of the, maybe we already said, or maybe I already said this, but I felt like a lot of the dark humor is coming from the abused character Suchi, who seems like old beyond her years, which gives her that unique perspective. But of course, the reason she's seems old beyond her years and has seen too much is because she's being abused, and the fact that that adds to the narration and makes it a bit more interesting isn't a bad thing, but it is maybe like a dark or troubling quality. And yeah, like, so it's not necessarily an easy read that everyone's going to get, but okay, I feel like we could go on and on and on talking about how interesting the book is, so I should accelerate us to the miscellaneous questions. First one is, if you could think of could you think of a Chinese word of the day to sort of capture the spirit of the book?
Yeah, so the actual title of the original novel, it's the paradise is actually lèyuán, and lèyuán can be interpreted very differently. It can also be amusement park. Like I'm going to this lèyuán,
Oh,
like all these like roller coasters and Ferris wheel and all that. There's like all kinds of things to play with, but it can also signify like some kind of like your own paradise, your own world, like the world you think operates for you. Or some people interpret heaven as paradise as well. Just depending how you
right.
like how you see this word. So I feel like it's maybe quite a nice word to introduce to everyone, because it has so many layers of meanings depending on the context.
Okay, so we got our word of the day, lèyuán. Perfect. All sorts of, I'll have to make some difficult choices about how to write the English translation. Maybe I'll just put all the different meanings /////. Okay, next miscellaneous question, probably a harder one. What piece of music would you pair with the book? So like something to listen to as you're reading it, or if we're making the film adaptation, what's the big track in the soundtrack?
Yeah, there's actually a song from this French-speaking singer. Her name is Vita. It's Vitaa. And she has this song that's called Mon paradis secret, like my secret paradise.
J'ai fait couler un peu d'encre sur un bout de papier. J'ai falsifié mon présent pour pouvoir imaginer ce coin de ciel où se mélangent nos rêves et nos idées. À chacun sa vision étrange de ce havre de paix. Paradis, à moi, c'est semblant d'exister. Pourquoi plus j'avance, moins je le vois. Moi je le vois. Au-delà, à moi, sourire mes autres, mais pourquoi?
There are some of these lines where she said, I'm going there, and blah, blah, blah. And then she said, this is my own paradise. It makes me feel like I'm existing, but why? The more I advance, the fewer I see. And I see my happiness just turn out like this. Things like that. And it's actually kind of upbeat when you listen to it, but when you look at it, the lyrics, it's actually a little dark.
Got
And
that dark irony.
yeah, and because it's so dark and there's so much irony, and then it's an upbeat, it makes me think about the Fang idea of paradise. Like it's heavy, but it's somehow being brought forward with some kind of humor.
Right. Awesome. I'll share my own pick. Spoilers, listeners, Jenna knew about this one in advance. So I'm more explaining this one to you, the listeners. So it's the second time I've picked a song by a British group, Portishead. This one came out way after I thought they'd stop making music, but they released this one track.
Those happy days, they seem so hard to find. I tried to reach for you, but you have closed your mind. Whatever happened to our love? I wish I understood. It used to be so nice, it used to be so good. So when you're near me, darling, can't you hear me? SOS.
Not long after something awful happened to a woman in England, she was a Labour MP, I forget where in England, and I think she was shot, which is quite unusual in the UK. There's not much gun crime, but a seemingly random member of the public went up to her in public and shot her dead. I think it was because she had been friendly with like local, I don't know if they're Pakistani or Arab, but like she was part of her role in the community as an MP. She did a lot of work, or was often alongside the Muslim community in the area. And this was around the time of the Brexit referendum. So it was seen as a really troubling sign of something that was going on in society at the time. Fortunately, we've not really had much like that since, but it felt like this dark omen at the time. So Portishead produced this track, it's a cover of a song by ABBA. So ABBA, famous for these happy, whimsical songs. So it's the song SOS. So to be fair, that is like in ABBA's original, that is a sad song, but it is quite like, it's fairly fast tempo, it's upbeat, my musical vocabulary is not good, but it's like a ABBA pop song. But the Portishead version slowed it down, made it somber, and makes it sound like a sort of like a real SOS, like a desperate cry for help. And it has this just, I don't know, like how would I link it to the book? It just feels like it's coming from despair. I think that's the word. And although Sachi often is very animated, I guess she feels kind of bipolar. Like sometimes she's like, I don't know if comatose is the word, but in my memory, sometimes she's really inactive and depressed, but then other times she's very on edge, laughing out of nowhere. But underneath all that, you can tell that she's in a pretty dark place of despair, and all she really needs is for someone to help her. But what she won't do is, I guess, ask for help, except by the time she can, it's too late. So that's why I picked this cover of ABBA by Portishead, because that, and it's a powerful song. I wanted to get it in somewhere. So here it is.
Yeah, I did check out that song before, and it was really dark, and it feels like some kind of like manifestation. And for me, when I listened to that song, I feel like I was in a little bit in the setting of being super claustrophobic. But I totally see like why you were picking this song, and it makes a lot of sense, and especially knowing more about the background, the context of this song, it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean the MP, she was never, well, the person who shot her didn't sexually abuse her, but you could say there's a similarity because at the end of the day, it was a man hurting a woman. I guess in Fang Sachi's story, her life is ruined by that man, and I guess it becomes fatal in the end. But in this one, the woman's life wasn't ruined, but it was ended, and I guess it ruined the lives of like her husband and her community because she was their representative. But yeah, I could go on and on about that, but I won't. It's not a Brexit podcast; it's a literature podcast. I'll take it to the bonus question. So, long-term listeners, you'll know how this works. If you're new, then you will hear me ask Jenna the question. Then you will hear a bunch of scrambled nothing. If you want to hear the answer to the question, it goes up on the show's Patreon, which is at patreon.com/TrChFic, TrChFic. All the other bonus questions answers are up there. So that's that. The bonus question for you, Jenna, not Gemma, is a simple one. Do other authors in Taiwan write stories similar to Fang Sachi's First Love Paradise? Okay, I'll wind up the bonus question there. So again, listeners, if you want the answer to that question, it's on Patreon. Go sign up before I hit episode 100 and pause the whole thing. For this interview, I'll take us to the final questions. I guess this one is essentially already answered. I was going to say, if our listeners want more like this book, where would you direct them? I think we've answered that question many times already. I have no other genius recommendations myself. Jenna, is there any other books you would want to name drop, or do you think we've done that mission?
Yeah, I think we've done a mission. There's just a lot of books that haven't been translated. And I'm sure I'm very curious, just like what are other Me Too movement titles around the world, and not just in East Asian context, but maybe like in Europe, Africa, and so many other places. And I feel like sometimes I imagine this list of Me Too titles all together as collective voice, even though they're talking about different stories. But who doesn't have different stories? We're all speaking about different stories. But it's about like bringing them together as collective voice.
I'd be curious to know, like, I bet there are loads of autobiographies about, those topics, people who survived abuse. But yeah, like, how many novels are there, and especially novels in translation and globally? I guess it's a nice thing about literary translation is it's a chance to link up stories that wouldn't otherwise be linked because they'd have the language barrier. And for better or for worse, English has that sort of universal side to it that most other languages don't. So I feel like, not to say that English is the god language and literature is not worth a damn if it's not in English, but I guess by taking this one into English translation, you've given it a really big step to linking up with other works of fiction that are relevant to real stuff going on in the world.
Yeah, there's also remember this other novel from a Dutch writer. It's called The Discomfort of Evening by I don't know how to pronounce the name, but I would pronounce it as Marieke Lucas Rich Neveld. I've heard people talk about this book as well. I haven't finished the entire book, but I heard it's also about the sexual abuse.
There are some crazy words in Dutch. I was just hanging out with a friend yesterday. He's English, completely English, but he has a Dutch surname, and it's Potjewid, and I won't even try and spell it. It's just mental, their spellings. Was that one called Discomfort of the Evening?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I'll try and put that in the show notes. All right, final question then. Is there anything you're working on or have worked on recently that you'd like listeners to know about, or places where they can learn more about you?
Yeah, I've been working on this Lèyuán Goddess's Cafeteria. That's a very feminist book, and it's also there's a lot about the portraying of the Taiwanese society against all these microaggressions and sexual harassment. And there's this other author, He Wenjing, who's also wrote this short story collection. There's a lot about the LGBTQ plus topics, and under the traditional Taiwanese like home-like setting, which is really interesting because there's a lot of conflicting scenes about the traditions and like the new ways of thinking about gender. Trying not to spoil here, but it's temporarily translated as that day we follow the chicken butt to find our way.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, those are the two. There's another one I was working at. There's just been a lot of projects I'm juggling for.
Okay, well, we're all cheering for you. I hope they all work out as best they can. Right, that's all my questions. Is there anything we've not covered that you'd like to just throw in here, or are we all good?
No, I think we've covered basically everything. And I guess one of the things I was talking to other translators about is we know how Me Too movement started in Hollywood, but we never really know how Me Too movement started in other countries. And just like the Me Too book list, I'm wondering about myself. Like, I just wonder how these movements started and from which industry it started in different countries, in different cultures. Because I know in Taiwan, some of them are like the most recent wave started from the political parties, kind of.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, people starting to call out people, and then like like the acting industry also started to talk about it. It just spread to different industries and became more of a collective voice. And there's a lot of calling out of someone. Yeah, these are like the things I wonder about as I start to look at Me Too in more expensive perspective. Yeah, and hopefully in the future we get to figure out like what are other representations and what are other stories.
Yeah, it's interesting. We all hear the American stories and then we know our local stories, but then we maybe don't know about, like, neither of us are American. I'm not sure how much you know about the big scandals in the UK. I mean, they're mostly linked to television, especially the BBC, and then we had the royal family, Prince Andrew. I don't know how much that one traveled globally, but if someone was to ask me what are the big Me Too scandals in anywhere apart from the UK or America, I'd be stuck. I spend so much time learning about China, but if someone asked me what is the biggest Me Too scandal in China, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know what to say. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The global stories are just as important, even though all eyes are on, say, like Hollywood and Harvey Weinstein, people like that.
Yeah,
so
exactly. It's always interesting to talk about this.
Totally. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming on to talk about this honestly amazing book. I hope loads of people read it, and thank you.
And thank you so much for inviting me here.
It's all right. All right, we've drawn to the end of the show, so huge thank you again to Jenna. It was a lovely chat, and I know I said it again and again in the intro, but it's a worthy book to cover. At the time of this episode being published, I don't think the book will be out in translation, but you should all keep your eyes open for it, because among many other things, it's a fantastic debut for Jenna, and I'm not just saying that. Speaking of not just saying, I would normally do the plugs here, but like, we're so close to the end of the pod before I put it on hiatus. I think what I'll just say is I'll just recount something I did this past weekend, rather than directing you to things that you probably already know about, like the Patreon, the Instagram, my Twitter, all that stuff. So yeah, I was at two events from the from the Cinemas Books UK tour. I think I've talked about that in recent TrChFic news. So I was at their Manchester event and their Leeds event, and long story short, they're touring with 2 authors who they managed to get over from China, or at least over from abroad. One is Liang Hong and the other is Jenna. It was a fantastic time. Probably, I don't know what to say. You should definitely check out these 2 authors. I had previous contact with Liang Hong. Well, not contact, but I'd seen her in the flesh before, because she was at an after event from the whichever London book fair I covered on the show. I think 2018. I don't think it was 2000. Sorry, I think it was 2019. I don't think it was 2018. Liu Jianyun, I had seen a film for which he wrote the script and also the novel it was based off of. I think it's come up on the podcast probably at some point. It's I Am Not Madame Bovary, Chinese title 我不是潘金莲, I think, and the novel is called I believe there's a translation of the novel which is called I Did Not Kill My Husband. I believe the book is also called 我不是潘金莲. But yeah, so I hadn't heard of him, but I also had, if you see what I mean. And I got to meet the people from the 2 ladies that run the Leeds Centre for New Chinese Writing again, Frances and Sarah. Long-time listeners, you might have heard those names. And also there was a ton of this is just an Easter egg for people who are long-time listeners and can remember who all the different guests were, I guess. A ton of different former show guests were in the room at the Leeds event. Like, let me count them. Nikki Harman was there. Daniel Lee from Cinemas Books was there. Piotr, you might remember him from the episode on Lenin's Kisses. He was in the room. And Jenna Stafford, or Gemma. Oh dear. Gemma, I think, This is embarrassing. I'm going to have to look this up. Yes, Gemma Stafford from the Bye Chat My Cat Hates Me episode was there. I think that's all the show guests that were in the room. Pretty sure. Yeah, they were all there. It was cool. And I was just there. I was there as a guest, but also helping out with helping Cinemas Books out with the little minute things, just an extra pair of hands, basically. And there was a really nice moment where I think Frances, one of the Leeds Centre readers, mentioned who I was, thanked me for helping out, and she said, yeah, this is the guy from the Translated Chinese Fiction podcast. And I think a few listeners must have been in the room, but they didn't know what I looked like, because obviously podcast is audio, so why would they? But that was kind of, I don't know how many people were just surprised that such a podcast would exist, but at least some people seemed like they knew the show but didn't know what I look like. So I'm being self-indulgent here, but that was really gratifying. So yeah, I would encourage you all, by the way, if you've not been to the Leeds Centre for New Chinese Writing's website, go do it. If you're in the UK, keep a look out for what events they do. Similarly, the Manchester event was held at an amazing venue, which if you live in Manchester or near, you should check out. It's called the Portico Library. I believe it's free to visit. A little hard to, it's very central, but you probably walk past the entrance very easily. And the co-host alongside Cinemas Books for that event was the Manchester China Institute, which is based inside the University of Manchester. They, not all year, but they do seasons or runs of free events on, it's not just literature, it's all sorts of things China related. But I've been to at least one, what am I talking about? I've been to 2 of their literary events, the one this past weekend and one way before, which I might have mentioned on the show. I don't know. Yeah, so that's, screw the plugs. I just thought I'd tell that story before winding the show up. Of course, there is one other thing I have to do, and that's I have to tell you who to recommend the show to. Although this one's a little rough because, you'll know that I'll say something like, tell your friends, tell your family, tell your teacher, and then I say tell, and I say tell an imaginary person that's some kind of something based on a character that we encountered in the novel or in the story. But our options for this book are mostly people who are sexually or violently abused, or people who do sexual abuse or domestic violence. Really, the option I have is the 2 best friends, Fang and forgot, but her friend. So it would just be tell your best friend, tell your confidant, tell your diary, tell your secret diary. Yeah, okay, let's go with that. So the best thing you can do for this show is, of course, to tell other people. Tell your teacher, tell your parent, tell your confidant, and tell your secret diary. Although a secret diary can't actually subscribe to the show, so I don't know, if it makes you feel good, do that. It doesn't benefit me. What can I say? Until next time, until episode 98, getting near the end here, 再见.